Hello, my name is John Mark Johnson Jr. I am the host of Reform GGA, and today I am rather excited about the fact that I got my rock in caliber 5.7 by 28 back from Palmetto State Armory. I had some issues out of the box, sent it in for warranty work and got it back like 2 or 3 weeks ago. And I was able to go out and do some testing on it, and initially I thought that this video was actually going to be on this gun in particular and how it performed and all those kinds of things, but in testing it I got some somewhat, we'll say, interesting results. It fared better than I thought it would, but it wasn't perfect. And so before I actually do a proper review on this gun itself, I want to go out and do some more testing with it. So in the meantime, instead of talking about the peculiarities of this gun and reviewing this gun in particular, let's step back and talk about the cartridge that it fires, especially in terms of it being a viable self-defense round in handguns specifically. So this is the cartridge that it fires, or at least an example of. This is one particular manufacturer's version, and, well, yeah, one particular product that would be within the 5.7 by 28 family of cartridges. So this, I believe, is the SS197SR from FN. This one is the one that has the 40 grain VMAX projectile. You can see the little blue tip there. Looks basically like just a little mini rifle cartridge, just kind of a little varmint cartridge, if you will. And just for a comparison, the nickel-plated cartridge that I'm holding in my right hand is a Federal HST with a 124 grain projectile. Of course, it's a hollow point. And I'm using these two as a comparison because we're talking about 5.7 by 28 as a defensive round. And of course, the much more conventional defensive round that 5.7 by 28 is trying to compete with is, of course, a 9mm, and the HST loading from Federal is a pretty decent loading out there. This one was law enforcement surplus, so I was able to get it fairly cheaply, and it's also a plus P round, which is nice. A little bit more extra power there. And it's a pretty decent performer, and it passes all the FBI specs and all those kinds of things, so it's a pretty decent round. And these two rounds, not only are they competing in the same market space, but they also, in terms of intention of how you're supposed to use them, that is, they're not just range ammo, there's something beyond normal range ammo. Whether or not they really qualify as defensive cartridges, especially in the case of 5.7 by 28, I would argue is a little, not quite so certain. But they're not normal, just target cartridges. And in addition to kind of competing in the same space of, kind of being both defensive rounds, they're also competitive in the sense that these ones at least cost me about the same amount per round. Both of them wound up costing me about 60 cents per round. Depending on where you buy them and what time, is it surplus, is it in bulk, is it not? The price is going to vary a little bit, but the Federal HST 124 grain plus B and loads like this from FN that are not just typical plinking loads but something a little bit beyond that will usually be at least in the same ballpark as far as price. Okay, so now to back up just a little bit and give us a little bit of context for why this cartridge is even on the American market in the first place and why we would be wondering about its viability as a self-defense cartridge, we need to go basically back to the 1990s, where basically NATO decided that they wanted to replace the 9mm. That was essentially what it was all about. A lot of people have mistakenly thought that the PDW program back in the 1990s that NATO funded, that was all about finding a good PDW weapon and creating a whole new technology, basically, and that's not really what it was about. It was realistically about NATO trying to get rid of 9mm, and not so much NATO themselves as certain we'll say, voices in NATO, trying to get a bunch of nations to change out of 9mm, because frankly there was a lot of money wrapped up in 9mm systems. A lot of people were already committed to 9mm production in terms of ammunition, and they had a lot of weapon systems that use 9mm. Handguns and submachine guns and the PDWs of the time, because things that are in between handguns and rifles that are fit for an individual to protect themselves with, not necessarily fight a war with, that concept actually isn't new, and a lot of people would argue that the PDW concept, maybe not that term, but the concept of a personal defense weapon, at the very least, goes back to World War II with the American M1 carbine. The M1 carbine basically filled that role. It was something that was easier to use, especially at range, than a traditional handgun, but it wasn't as heavy as the battle rifles of the time, like the M1 Garand battle rifle. So the concept of something that's in between, that has enhanced range over a handgun, enhanced accuracy for the common user over a handgun, that's not a new concept at all. And back in the 1990s, when the PDW project was, spearheaded by NATO, it really wasn't a new concept. What they were trying to do, or at least, like I said, certain forces within NATO, certain people within NATO, were trying to force a changeover from 9mm, basically so that ammo manufacturers, and gun manufacturers could get a whole lot of new contracts. As far as I can tell, that's really what it was all about, was people saying, if we got them all to replace this caliber, they'd have to buy all new weapons, and they'd have to completely switch out their ammo stockpiles and whatnot, and there'd be a lot of money to make in replacing all of those things. That, as far as I can tell, was the real reason behind the PDW program. And so the program requirements that they laid out was basically something that would do what 9mm was already doing for most of these countries, with a few enhancements to make sure that you didn't just wind up with 9mm again. And the enhancements that they required that would basically keep normal 9mm out of the running for this project was that it had to be able to defeat a certain level of body armor. Some people have mistakenly thought that the body armor was Russian paratrooper body armor, but that's actually never mentioned in any of the stuff that NATO put out on this. Instead, what it actually mentions was basically soft armor, Kevlar armor, not rifle rated at all, just very basically handgun armor. It was basically enough armor to stop a normal 9mm, but it was not nearly as strong as what a lot of the paratroopers from the opposing forces would be using, not rifle rated in basically any way, shape, or form, unless you want to count 22 long rifle. But in terms of serious centerfire cartridges, the ammo wasn't expected to go through that kind of armor. They just wanted something that would keep 9mm out of the running, and 9mm is stopped by conventional Kevlar vests, and so that's what they made the standard. You got to be able to get through a standard Kevlar vest, more or less, something that 9mm normally wouldn't do. Keep 9mm out of the running, because that's what they were trying to replace. So that was one kind of enhancement over 9mm, and the other one was the range. 9mm guns most of the time have a fairly poor ballistic coefficient and a fairly low muzzle velocity, and so their effective range is usually pretty limited. For handguns, they're usually not terribly effective past about 25 yards. Put it in a submachine gun or something like that, and 50 yards is pretty comfortable, but you still wind up losing a lot of effectiveness past 50 yards, at least when you're using the gun on semi-auto. Now, if you're just, doing the full auto thing and kind of doing the spray and pray thing, well, you can kind of lob rounds out there and hit a general area for a pretty good long distance with 9mm, but you're not really going to be aiming at a precise target when you're doing that. In terms of being able to pick out a single target and hit that target with a single round intentionally on the first shot, 9mm, like I said, really, really, really decreases in performance after 50 yards. 100, you can still kind of make it work. It's not great, but more often than not, at least if you have a fairly large target facing you broadside, you can make it work. It's virtually useless at 200, because at 200 you have to usually hold over the targets, and you're aiming somewhere off in space to hit this thing down here that's now being covered by the gun that's aimed up. Not really an ideal situation. And so the other enhancement they wanted was that it would actually be able to engage a silhouette, a full-size silhouette at 200 yards without having to aim too high. Fairly minor compensation would get you on target for a full-size silhouette. So effective on full-size silhouettes out to 200 yards, and something that could get through basic Kevlar. And these were picked because they knew that 9mm wouldn't be able to do those things. There were lots of rounds that wound up being submitted. The two that wound up surviving were, of course, the 5.7x28 that we still have today. The other one that survived that is much less plentiful on the American market is the 4.6x30 that was submitted by HK out of Germany. And there was kind of a latecomer to the whole PDW project. They kind of jumped into the project after it had already been several years in development, like almost a decade in development, and said, oh, by the way, we have something for this as well. And so it kind of got tacked on at the end. And with HK being HK and not really wanting civilians to have their guns all that much, excuse me, digestive issues for any of you who don't know, just ignore it. But yeah, HK is not really well known for sharing with civilians, and so there isn't really any HK guns out there that are widely available that use the 4.6x30 round that they developed. But those wound up being the main two that survived. There were others that went through the trial as well but got weeded out. One of them that is very important and a good evidence for this being basically just trying to force people to buy new guns and ammo is the 224 BAS. Originally, the 224 BAS was a 10mm cartridge that was necked down to 224, as the name implies. And when it was the 10mm that was necked down, at least initially, it seemed to have had some favor, at least with certain people that were heading up this project. But it was a little bit overpowered in terms of how easy it was to handle, because it's 10mm, and a full pressure 10mm round has a little bit of a kick. And so if you're talking about people that are not expected to shoot normally, trying to use this thing that's a little bit more powerful than most of the other stuff is, that created some problems. And so the people that were in charge of the development of 224 BAS said, okay, instead of basing it on the 10mm cartridge, let's go ahead and use a neck down 9mm casing instead. That doesn't have as much powder, of course, and not going to be quite as stout of a load. And the people who were working on the 224 BAS and trying to make this work, they thought that basically redoing it in 9mm, a neck down 9mm case, would have the added benefits, and they obviously didn't get the memo on what the project was really about, but they switched over to the 9mm because the 10mm was a little too powerful. And when they switched over to 9mm, one of the things that came up almost immediately was, well, if we base this on 9mm, we don't actually have to change out the systems completely. You could still use 9mm as your training round, and then when the time comes to use the high performance round, basically just swap out the barrel. You could probably even reuse a lot of the magazines, swap out the barrel, swap out the recoil spring, and presto, now you've got your super duper long range armor piercing round. Goes through Kevlar, doesn't really go through much of anything else. But they thought that this was a great thing, so that the minimal changeover from the old weapon systems, I mean literally just a new barrel, a spring, maybe a new magazine, and off you are. And as soon as the people who were in charge of the project saw that this thing would not completely eliminate 9mm, but instead allow 9mm to remain around, they killed the 224 BAS pretty much right there. Now, the 224 BAS didn't completely die. It actually did survive in what is known as 22 TCM today, which is a neck down 9mm. That's basically exactly what the 22 TCM is. But it's not a PDW cartridge, at least according to NATO. According to NATO, the PDW cartridges are good little 5.7x28s, and of course the HK equivalents that the HK submitted might have said that wrong. The 5.7 by 28 was from FN, from Fabrique Nationale in Belgium, I think it is. They're based out of there. And then, like I said, the HK, of course, is based in Germany. And those were the ones that wound up passing the muster to become the next PDW cartridge. But in the process of all this political hoopla, and especially when 224 Boz got kicked out of the running, it became pretty clear to everybody that all that this was just a way to try to get rid of 9mm systems and force people to pay for new ammunition and new systems in place of that. And so a lot of the NATO countries, you know, they liked their 9mm. They didn't want to have the changeover. They didn't want to have to spend that kind of money. And so the project kind of petered out. A few law enforcement and special agencies wound up picking up these fancy new PDW cartridges and the gun designs that went along with them. For the 5.7 by 28, the main gun that it was meant to go in was the P90. And for the 4.6 by 30, the main gun that was supposed to go in was the MP7. Both of which were, you know, fine in their own right. But like I said, most nations weren't just not hearing it. Like I said, it only wound up being in limited use with very few agencies. It didn't catch on as a whole like they wanted it to. And commercially, it was kind of sort of a flop. And HK, being HK, they didn't necessarily mind that this thing didn't blow up and become all that great because they were, you know, only really interested in government contracts anyway. They've never really been big on civilian sales. FN, on the other side, that makes the 5.7 by 28, they've always been a little bit more open to civilian sales, especially in America. And so they took these weapons that were not performing very well in the military government sector, and they released them on the commercial sector in order to increase their sales, and they made civilian versions of it. So instead of releasing P90s to the civilians, they released PS90s to the civilians. Had a longer barrel, doesn't have the fun switch, so it's just semi-auto. But they released that, and they also released the FN 5.7. That particular model of gun is called the FN 5.7, and it is a handgun in 5.7 by 28. And that was basically their way to try to increase sales. So they really built this thing up as much as they could to kind of make it popular, and it did actually wind up becoming something that was fairly popular. It wound up entering video games, it wound up entering a number of movies, some TV series. What was it? Stargate SG-1 was one of the series that wound up picking up the P90 as a weapon of the protagonist, so that was cool. And so through basically a lot of advertising to the commercial market, FN was able to make some of that money back in terms of sales to civilians, but not too shortly after they started getting into civilian sales, Fort Hood happened. And famously, the Fort Hood shooting was one that involved an FN 5.7 handgun shooting the little 5.7 round. And yeah, that was a really, really, really dark day in history. I think it was something like 37 individuals total that were injured. I think about a dozen of them died. That really, 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 really messed with 5.7 on the commercial market, because it pretty much instantly got a bad reputation after the Fort Hood shooting. And people were touting it as being the cop killer, and it's this evil, terrible, nasty round because it has virtually no recoil, and yet it can go through body armor, and you know, that's the only reason why people on the commercial market would want to buy this thing, is because they want to kill our cops. And so FN had to respond to that, at least to some extent, to try to salvage what sales they could. And so they pulled certain ammunitions off of the market, ones that were specifically designed to get through that armor that was a part of the original NATO test. Now, like I said, the armor requirement was only there in the first place to keep 9mm out of the running, because that's what people were trying to do, is they wanted to get people to buy new systems so that they could make a lot of money on those new systems. The armor requirement actually wasn't that as big of a deal as a lot of people make it out to be, but that was basically how FN responded. They took out the stuff that was specifically designed to get through body armor, and most of the commercial loads that have wound up being on the market ever since have been a little bit lower in power, we'll say. Not quite the full load that the cartridge is capable of. But despite that happening with Fort Hood, that very bad incident that gave it a lot of negative press, and despite the fact that a lot of the more commonly available loads on the market right now are not particularly impressive loads, despite all that, 5.7x28 has actually grown in popularity, especially recently, and there have been a lot of different manufacturers that have gotten into making 5.7x28 caliber weapons. You have Kel-Tec with their P90 and their P50. P90 is the FN model, Kel-Tec is the P50 for their pistol, and they also make an R50, that's a rifle version of their pistol. So they have their 5.7x28 guns. Ruger has a few different 5.7x28 guns. There's the Ruger 5.7, which is a handgun, and then there is the LC carbine, which is a 16-inch barreled rifle in that caliber, and then there's also the LC Charger from Ruger, which is like a 10-inch version. It's kind of between the other two. CMMG has their variants out. Was it Diamondback? There's another one that kind of makes PDW style ones as well, in addition to CMMG and those. And then Smith & Wesson fairly recently also came out with the 5.7x28 handgun. And of course the gun that I'm still in the process of testing, the Palmetto State Armory Rock in 5.7x28. So there's actually a good number of companies that make a pretty wide variety of 5.7x28 guns now. And it's kind of an interesting phenomenon, because when you look at most of the ammo that's available on the commercial market, it's not particularly impressive. And the guns themselves, I wouldn't say, are particularly impressive either. Let me show you what I mean by that. All right, so the handguns that are on the market right now, they're all relatively close to the Rock 5, to the Rock in size. And of course, this is a gun with a 5-inch barrel. It's technically over a 5-inch barrel. It's like a 5.2 or something like that. But something pretty close to 5 inches is pretty common with all of the handguns out there that I've seen, at least. They're all at least a 5-inch barrel or longer. And they're almost always basically full size or duty size. And for those of you guys who don't know how the size system works with handguns, at least with 9mm and cartridges that'd be relatively close to 9mm, anything from 4 3/4 inches barrel in terms of barrel length, 4 3/4 inches up to 5 1/4 inches, that would be the duty size. Basically the size of handgun that you wear when you're not worried about concealing it, like say cops who just wear it on their belt. They're not trying to, tuck it or hide it into clothing at all. A very much bulky size, but typically much easier to handle when it's that size. And you also get better ballistics because you have a longer barrel, which usually means more muzzle energy, so a little bit more effectiveness as well, at least if you're pairing it with the right cartridge. So 4 3/4 to 5 1/4, that's the duty size. 4 1/4 up to 4 3/4, not including the 4 3/4 though, that would be what would be considered full size, like a full size Glock, a Glock 17 would fall into that category, which is also used by police and those kinds of things, but it's semi-capable of being concealed, and technically you can conceal anything with enough fabric and enough layers. But yeah, the full-size guns aren't quite in that category of being very concealable. Technically doable, but not great. But just a little bit smaller, a little bit lighter, a little bit easier to carry. And then about 3 3/4 up to 4 1/4, but not including the 4 1/4, is where you get the compacts. So like the Glock 19 would be considered a compact. Just a little bit shorter, a little bit smaller, and something that you could conceal on your person pretty reasonably. Still kind of want to be wearing the looser clothes. It's not exactly, you know, your t-shirt and, you know, board shorts kind of thing. But a person who is dressed semi-casually can conceal a Glock 19 pretty easily. So that would be the compact size. And then 3 1/4 up to 3 3/4, but not including the 3 3/4, that would be the subcompact size. I actually have a subcompact to show you guys. This is the SIG 365 XL in 9mm. This one has a 3.7-inch barrel, and so it is kind of at the far side of what a subcompact size would be in a 9mm. And then anything that has a barrel length that is under 3 1/4 would be considered a micro. I do not have a micro anymore. I used to own one. That would be my Springfield Hellcat. When I had it, it would be considered a micro because it was like a 3.1-inch barrel or something like that. So that's the sizes. And the 5.7 by 28 guns, they're pretty much on the extreme end of that spectrum. They've almost always got a barrel length that's pretty close to 5 inches, so not only are they bigger than the average full-size pistol, but they're full-on duty size. And I do have a duty size 9mm to compare it to. This is my CZ P09, and this would be considered a duty size 9mm handgun. The barrel, I think, is like 5.15 inches or something like that. So definitely duty length, and it's pretty much the exact same size as the Rock in terms of slides. They are virtually identical. Now, my P09 is, of course, hammer fired, so the back end of it, of course, has the hammer interface and all that, but the barrel length itself is pretty much the same. They do differ a little bit, not by a ton, but a little bit in terms of the length of the actual pistol grip. P09 has a bigger grip. And in terms of capacity, they're semi-similar. So here is the magazine for the Rock. Here is the magazine for the P09 that I just showed you, and this one has a +2 base plate that extends under the grip. So this one, as it is configured right now, holds 21 rounds. Without the little base plate on the bottom, it would only hold 19. The magazine for the Rock 5.7 holds 23 rounds. So 19 in a flush fit versus 23 in a flush fit. And that leads to the basic conclusion that we're trying to get at here is evaluating 5.7 by 28 as a handgun round. Here's the problem. Because of where the ammunition sits in the commercial market right now, most of it being on the lower end, you can get some higher end stuff. Some of it is still available, and there's some boutique loads out there that sell to the that are made by certain manufacturers that will sell to the commercial market. But a lot of those higher end rounds tend to be considerably more expensive. 5.7 by 28 is already a fairly expensive round as it is. A lot of even the plinking ammunition is usually pretty close to 50 cents a round or sometimes more. Especially if you're buying from a local in-person shop instead of, you know, ordering bulk online or something like that. 5.7 by 28 is fairly expensive. The real good ammunition that's going to give you a lot better performance isn't widely available, and it certainly isn't cheap. And so you do wind up with some performance problems relative to the size of the weapon. Like I said, pretty much all of them are duty-sized guns. And so you have to carry around a duty-sized gun. And granted, most of them are fairly light. Like this one, for example, is only like 26 ounces unloaded, whereas the CZ-P09 in 9mm is like 32 ounces unloaded. So, I mean, in terms of the weight that you're carrying around, yeah, the 5.7 guns are going to be better that way, but you're not really minimizing on size at all, because, like I said, they're pretty much all full-size or duty-size guns. And just to put it in comparison of what I would consider my standard carry gun, here's my SIG 365 XL that I normally carry. And as you can see, my SIG 365X carry is 365XL, which I carry, is of course substantially smaller than the 5.7 by 28 alternative. Now, Palmetto has said that they plan on making a compact version of the Rock at some point, but then you're going to get even further problems in terms of power, because like I said, most of the rounds that are on the commercial market are already kind of been neutered. They've already kind of been diminished in power. And just to put it in perspective, this gun with a barrel that is over 5 inches has about the same power as a 9mm would out of a 3-inch barrel. So I need basically 2 more inches to get the comparable muzzle energy. And for those of you who say that 5.7 by 28 is basically just glorified 22 Magnum, there is some truth to that. 22 Magnum fired out of a 16-inch barrel is roughly equivalent to 5.7 fired out of a 5-inch barrel. So there is some overlap, but those are pretty different barrel lengths. But technically there is some overlap. Out of a handgun, 5.7 by 28 usually has a muzzle energy in the mid 200s, like 240 to 260. Sometimes you can get it up to 270 and beyond, but those are usually powdered loads that you're going to pay substantially more for. But yeah, usually somewhere in the mid 200s, sometimes kind of eking into the higher 300s. But if you're stuck with handgun size, you're going to be, somewhere in the 200s in terms of muzzle energy. And if you try to make a compact form of that, you're going to have even less muzzle energy. And so it's not particularly powerful. So that's one reason why people don't like it. Another reason that people don't like it is that even though it is often touted as being a low recoil alternative to 9mm, it's not that much lower. Now, in certain operating systems, it can feel quite a bit lower, like the Smith & Wesson M&P in 5.7 by 28. It actually has a very, very different operating system. Most of the operating systems that are in handguns for 5.7 by 28, most of them are some version of a delayed blowback type system. But Smith & Wesson instead decided to do basically a gas-operated system, and that greatly reduces the felt recoil. Excuse me. The problem, of course, with that substantially reduced felt recoil is that sometimes the gun can be a little bit finicky in terms of whether or not you put an optic on it. That can mess with it and change the reliability. There are going to be some loads that it won't necessarily like. Gas systems on handguns tends to just make them rather finicky, and you usually wind up finding, 2 or 3 types of ammo that it does like, and you kind of stick only with those types of ammunition because those are the only ones that work, kind of thing. Yeah, the gas system isn't perfect, but it does reduce recoil. For all of the other guns, though, it's not as much of a recoil reduction as you might think. Like I said, I did take the 5.7 out, the Rock 5.7 out, and test it, and invited a couple other people to come with me so that I could kind of get other people's opinions of it. One person who usually handles recoil a little bit better than I do, and one person who is usually substantially worse at handling recoil compared to myself. And basically what I found in observing myself with the gun and observing these 2 other people with the gun is that if you're already proficient with 9mm, 5.7 by 28 had enough reduction in recoil that you can notice a substantial difference in how you shot. That is, you could get a little bit better accuracy, and you could certainly get follow-up shots quite a bit faster. But if you're talking about someone who wasn't proficient with 9mm in terms of recoil, putting a 5.7 in their hands did not automatically make them proficient. It doesn't work like that. It's not that much of a reduction. 5.7 by 28 only has about a 30% reduction in recoil over 9mm in terms of just the raw power there. Of course, the operating system and the particular load that you're talking about, and whether or not you're talking about a handgun that happens to have an optic on it or not, all that's going to play into the actual felt recoil that you get at the end. But to start off with, just in terms of the raw power there, 5.7 by 28 is only about a 30% reduction in recoil energy. So it's not that greatly reduced. It's not like it's half. It's not like it's a quarter of the total. It's still going to have a certain amount of recoil there. There's still a certain amount of power there. And so the low recoil aspect of switching over to 5.7 by 28, as per the people that I've tested it with, one person of whom definitely has grip strength issues. She's a woman whose hands have become fairly arthritic, and so gripping tightly onto things actually really hurts her. She finds it extremely uncomfortable, and of course that makes shooting handguns extremely uncomfortable. And yeah, her results with it were not particularly good. She did about as poorly with the 5.7 by 28 as she would do with 9mm or 380s, both of which we had out there that day as well. In terms of handguns, we had a handgun that was in 9mm, and we also had a handgun that was in 380, and frankly she shot them pretty much all the same, which is to say not terribly well. The other guy that I had out there, he I would say was at least a level of proficiency with 9mm, and he was able to shoot the 5.7 pretty much like he would shoot the 9mm or the 380. He's also a guy that really likes 45 ACP and those kinds of things, and with most handguns he's reasonably proficient for sure. And he did find it to be easier to shoot the 5.7, especially in terms of follow-up shots, but also bear in mind that he was already proficient with the vast majority of handgun rounds that are out there. There's not many of the common handgun rounds that he wouldn't be capable of handling. And me, myself, I'm fairly recoil sensitive, so I don't like some of the bigger handgun rounds, like a full power 357 load or a full power 10mm load. Definitely not my thing. Even 40 can be a little bit out there for me, depending on how it's loaded. But I still didn't notice that much of a difference with the 5.7. Yes, a little bit faster, a little bit easier to be accurate with it. Now, the particular gun that we were dealing with seemed to have some sight alignment issues, and so we'll have to look at that. But in general, I would say it's a little bit easier to be accurate with it. But it's not this drastic thing that people talk about. A 30% reduction in recoil is enough to feel, but it's not necessarily enough to make a great difference in performance. Now, if you're like a high-end competitor, trying to, do the gun gamer thing and, trying to get 20 rounds off in, 5 seconds, well, maybe not quite that much, but if you're trying to do the Jerry Mitchell kind of stuff, then those differences in recoil might actually be appreciable to you. But to the common person, that's just not a big enough difference to really make that much of a difference, to borrow Paul Harrell's term. So where does that leave my assessment of 5.7 by 28? Basically, that it is a cool cartridge that I got into. This was before I got laid off, of course, but got into it, and I think it's cool. It was definitely fun to shoot, at least in so much as it worked. It wasn't perfect in working all the time. Like I said, I want to do some more testing on it to really get into that particular gun and figure out exactly what's going on there. But yeah, it's really fun, relatively fun to shoot with and all that. But I just don't think that the performance is there. Like I said, despite being a full-size gun, it's got the power of a micro 9, so I mean you're not really gaining any power there. In terms of effectiveness on target, 5.7 by 28 and its more common commercial loadings isn't known to be a particularly effective man stopper. Of course, 9mm isn't necessarily either, but for 9mm we do have some reasonably cheap and effective hollow points, like this Federal HST 124 grain plus P ammo. Like I said, this is fairly cheap, bought it for just as cheap as I got the 5.7x28 ammo, and it basically passes all the FBI specs in terms of penetration, depth, and expansion, and all those kinds of things. So yeah, 9mm is of course considerably cheaper. You can get much smaller guns in 9mm. You can get cartridges in 9mm that actually perform quite well as defensive rounds. Yeah, 5.7x28 is a cool niche cartridge, but there really isn't anything in and of itself that's going to make it take over the self-defense market as far as average citizens are concerned. I think it's cool. It's definitely fun, but it's just not powerful enough, and if you compact it down as it is now, it becomes even less powerful. It'll be really interesting to see what PSA does with their compact version of their 5.7 handgun. But like I said, it's definitely not going to be more powerful. It's going to be less, but still be interesting to see how it turns out and how the market responds to it. But yeah, I've said all that basically to say that the 5.7x28 cartridge, although it has become popular, it's become cool. There are a lot of handguns that take it now from a lot of different companies. But at the end of the day, it's still not going to be a practical self-defense round. Yeah, that's my assessment of it. There's not much that the 5.7 round can do that normal 9mm can't do. And this is where people come back and they say, well, you know, 5.7 was designed to go through body armor. And like I said, it was a very basic body armor. But yes, it originally, in its military form, was designed to do that. But most of that military ammunition is not commonly available anymore. And it's not like 9mm rounds that are available to as civilians can't do the same thing. As an example of such, here is an 80 grain solid copper spun cartridge that is made for 9mm. Projectile is obviously a little bit different. And this one, out of the right length barrel, can actually go through some forms of soft body armor, just like 5.7x28 can also go through some forms of body armor. And now, in terms of the barrel length that you need to do that, it's always longer is better, but you're still talking about basically the same profile. This, like I said, is the P09 in 9mm, and with this little 80 grain solid copper spun projectile in it, it will in fact go through most of the soft body armor that is out there. Definitely through 2A, through a lot of the 3A. Now when you get into like the 3A plus or the 3A special threat, it doesn't always work. Excuse me. But if just the ability to defeat body armor is your thing, well, as a civilian, you can do that with rounds that are available on the civilian market in guns that are available on the civilian market in 9mm. So it's not like, you know, getting through body armor is the sole bailiwick, as Paul Harrell would say, of 5.7x28. 5.7x28 gets through some armor with some particular loadings, but that's entirely incidental. That was just a requirement that was put in there to keep 9mm from running as the PDW cartridge. That's the only reason why that requirement was put in there. So yeah, and granted, the media really hyped it up after the Fort Hood shooting and all that, and the whole armor-piercing side of it, and effing pulling the armor-piercing projectiles that they had on the civilian markets was a part of that whole thing. But in reality, 5.7x28 actually isn't even a lot of the specialty ammo that the military and law enforcement would have access to. Even that ammo is not terribly good at going through body armor. A lot of times it will get through basic body armor, but it doesn't penetrate very far after that. It's usually a penetration depth of like 6 to 8 inches most of the time, which is way off from what the FBI spec is. The FBI spec, in order to be considered an effective handgun ammunition, it needs to go through 12 to 18 inches of ballistic gel. Like I said, FN57, once it goes through body armor, it usually only goes like 6 to 8 inches into ballistic gel, and so it's not really effective at that either. So yeah, it's just, yeah, it's not really a practical handgun cartridge. but it's still fun. It's still cool. Just a part of us that, that part of us that is the true gun nerd that really likes seeing things that have become popular in culture. There's a lot of us who have at least seen some of the episodes of Stargate SG-1 and thought that the P90 that the characters used was cool. Those people that played video games that had the FN57 handgun in them usually thought of it as fairly cool. There's definitely a calling there, and there's definitely a cool factor and a fun factor there. I'm not trying to dissuade people from getting it for those reasons. I'm just saying that if you want something that's practical for self-defense, going with a cartridge that requires a fairly big gun to make it even remotely comparable to 9mm, because like I said, the breakdown is 3-inch in 9mm is roughly equivalent to 5-inch in 5.7x28, which is roughly equivalent to 16-inch in 22 Magnum. That's kind of the power spectrum there. It has to be in a fairly long barrel to be effective at all, and that's pretty much the exact opposite of what you want in a concealed situation. You want something that's basically as small as possible to make it as easy to conceal as possible. 5.7x28 doesn't really fit that niche very well. So, yeah. All right. That was me geeking out about 5.7x28 for like 45 minutes. For those of you who stuck around through the whole thing, thank you very much for your time. Thank you for letting me ramble on. For those of you who are in Christ, go with God and be blessed. For those of you who are not, I pray that you would come to know the true Christ of history, the only genuine Savior and Master of Masters. Amen.